Well, hello, friends, and welcome to Certified Forgotten, our 1 week before Halloween episode. So, you know, it's a very, 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 very special one. If this is your first time listening to the show, thank you for finding us. We're glad to have you. This is Certified Forgotten. We talk about horror films with 10 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. And sometimes we have episodes on new releases too. But this is one of our hour-long guest episodes where you're going to get to learn a little bit more about a writer in the horror film area, as well as a movie that they've picked that they brought to the table for us to talk about today. I'm Matt Monagle, one half of your Matt hosts. I am joined by my sickly partner in crime, my wheezy little boy. It's Matt Donato.
Wheezy little boy. I'm gravelly. I'm not Weasley. Weasley. I don't know. I'm
Easily, you're not wheezy.
it is let's just say I got the shit kicked out of me by a joint wedding overlap with Brooklyn Horror Festival that cut my festivities short, and now I'm quarantining in my childhood basement looking at all the old DVDs that I want to bring home again.
Where Brooklyn at? All up and down Matt Donato's immune system. That's where Brooklyn is at right now. That is a true story.
Excuse any gravel in my voice. I will do my best.
So, Donato, I'm glad to hear you're not dead, first of all. Second of all, I'm glad to hear you're feeling well. Obviously, we wouldn't be recording the podcast if you weren't mostly recovered and back on your feet. But third of all, you typically are the one who goes and finds our guests. But I would love for you to share an extra word as you introduce today's guest as to why you sought out this person in particular and sort of the enthusiasm that you shared with me when you were like, I need to go find somebody for a very specific reason.
Yeah, it's very simple. I like the movie that we are covering today, and I just saw it for the first time. I put myself through a little gauntlet of watching every haunt-based horror movie that I could. To start October, I had the idea to write a little piece for Slash Film, which I did, and I am a completionist, much to my own fault many times. So I sat there and I watched every single one. Scary Movie was a new to me watch, and it's on Screambox, which is wonderful. So I did the thing that I try to do for episodes sometimes to make it easy on us. It's great when we go to someone and we ask them, hey, bring us a movie that you love, and they think of a list. Sometimes it takes longer. So Letterboxd is really helpful because I can go on there and go, all right, who do I know that's seen this movie and likes it? Lo and behold, number one, Monagle, you're the first person that like comes up for me. You love this
Mhm.
already, so that was easy. And number two, like it's nice to get new voices on. This is what we always try to do. And I always think of like, oh, how can I bring somebody on? And our guest today was the second person that came up and loved it just as much as you. So without further ado, I'm going to cut right to it. We are bringing on Rocco T. Thompson of Rue Morgue, Slant, and 1/4 of the Lady Killers podcast. Rocco, welcome.
Abandon hope, all y'all who enter here. Thank you for having me. Matt, I thought that you were going to say that you missed me so much post Fantastic Fest. You just had to see me again, and that's why you invited me on.
You barely fucking saw me. You were hanging out with the fucking cool Fango crew. What do you mean? I barely saw you.
We exchanged a couple hugs, but
We did.
yes, I was with the hottest bitches at the fest, as I dubbed them. So
I love that. And, you know, I do want to make it very clear, Rocco, you are on the show because you are somebody that was on Donato's list and you liked the movie, not because you liked the movie. That
great.
letterbox ploy is not something that we just break out for everybody. There's a lot of people that like a lot of movies on letterbox, and most of them will never come on Certified Forgotten. So there is that.
I know he's just playing coy.
It's fine. So, Rocco, let's start as we always do by talking about your kind of early relationship to the horror genre. Turn the clock way back before you were hanging out with the hot Fangoria bitches to the beginning of your particular horror journey. What stands out is like that first movie, that first book, that first thing that kind of made you realize there was a type of movies that maybe were a little bit more of your favorite than everything else.
Yeah, so I was a '90s baby, and I have to say I always was sort of a scared but death haunted kid,
Hmm.
and I sort of blame that on being raised Catholic.
Hmm.
But I mean that also gave me a taste for the operatic and florid and gruesome as well. But I was a little scared to jump into the deep end with horror as a kid. I will say, however, that Disney Halloween was like the greatest thing to me because it was a way to engage with spooky stuff in a way that was really safe. So things like Don't Look Under the Bed,
Yeah.
especially Disney Channel original movies, those were definitely my gateway. But I was pretty spooked as a kid of a lot of things, and it was hard for me to really seek that stuff out. But I did see in 2002, the one that really changed everything for me was The Ring. Um,
Hmm.
that is definitely the first horror movie I like actually sat down and watched and like suffered through. And it hooked into me in a way that really opened up just the world of horror for me. And I've been a big fan ever since. So I came a little later than most people. You know, I always hear like on your pod, other pods, it's like, oh yeah, I saw something when I was 6, and I watched Halloween through from the banister of the stairs when my parents didn't know. But I
Yeah.
was, you know, too scaredy. It's too much of a scaredy cat to do that. But yeah, I came a little later, but I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, no, this is a team scaredy cat over here. I mean, that's exactly my journey as well. So you're echoing a lot of the things that resonate with me, but the fact that you went from Disney to The Ring, like arguably one of the scariest movies still to come out of the 2000s from America, like, yeah, that's quite the graduation.
Yeah, and it's funny. I saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Platinum Dunes remake around the same time, I think, but that really did nothing for me. It didn't scare me in any way. I've come to appreciate that movie a lot more now, but I did not like it then. But The Ring just, I don't know, it hooked me, like I said, and I would still say it's probably one of my top 10 favorite horror movies to this day.
I want to talk a little bit because you said exactly that a lot of people come in and I don't want to say that they're older, but I'm a millennial, Donato's a millennial. I never remember where the Gen Z boundary is. You're a millennial. We have Gen Xers that come on the show and talk about their experiences growing up in the 80s. But I am curious what the experience of growing up in like the late 90s, early 2000s as sort of a blossoming horror fan is, because that is often regarded as sort of like the dead spot for contemporary horror, right? Like the late 90s, the early 2000s, until we start to get a little bit more into like the direct to video or home video or streaming stuff. Books have been written about this sort of as like, yeah, there was like the torture porn stuff that was going on, but there wasn't the volume, there wasn't the creativity. We're still parsing through that period trying to figure out what's good. So do you feel like you grew up with the same kind of like volume of quality horror that you hear other people talking about?
Yeah, this is funny, and it's been on my mind a lot lately because I came to horror in the 2000s when I was, like post puberty, essentially, when I was headed into middle and high school. I missed that whole 90s wave of stuff. Like, I like Scream a lot, but it doesn't have a nostalgia factor for me because I just wasn't there for it. Um, but as I've gotten older, now I'm 34 this month, uh, I'm looking back at that 2000s horror that decade of 2000s horror, and like the torture porn, the new French extremity, the Rob Zombie of it all. And like I look on that with such fonder eyes than I did at the time.
Hmm.
And I've really come out, I think, Ariel Powers Shaw wrote her book, Millennial Nasties, and that helped me sort of come out as a millennial horror fan because I think now is the time when you kind of can. Um, I do think we were getting really interesting, really boundary pushing stuff at that time. And I think that gave me a taste for not just extreme horror, but also more art house fare, because I was seeking out things like New French Extremity that I don't think horror fans of decades past would look for something like that.
Yeah.
We had access to more, even though it was like Blockbuster Video, but it was also the rise of Netflix, when you were still getting the DVDs in envelopes. Um, I just feel like there was a really broad world of horror opening up in the 2000s. Even if it was kind of, xenophobic torture porn, which is sort of
Sure.
interesting in a contrasting way.
Donato, you were making some faces on me there when I was talking about that being a dead zone. I feel like you want to step in and defend millennial horror.
I have been defending millennial horror for years now on my Bloody Disgusting column about remakes and the fact that like I want to write a book and really investigate one point how criticism and Rotten Tomatoes fucked over horror so greatly during that period, because there's so much stuff we look back on, and horror fans reclaiming the Friday the 13th remake, the 13 Ghost remake, like all these things that have abysmal scores and were thrashed by critics, and at a time when critics were more relied upon and more read. And I want to investigate that way more, because I do believe in my heart that the 2000s, there's never been a bad era of horror.
You're
There have
home.
been
It's fine.
there have been different eras of horror, and there have been different transitions, and that's always what happens. And we're coming out of the back end of the trauma era, I guess, right now. But like the 2000s, that like new metal horror era, that whole thing, I know it's not everyone's bag, but there are so many good movies that get overlooked, and the fact that, like, I don't know, I had to be a fucking martyr for half of these and just be like, "No, this remake's fucking good. I don't know why we hated it." And the hatred, I wanna know where that comes from, and it is post 9/11. It's all these things that we were turned off to horror for many reasons, and it was torn apart for many reasons, and yeah, no, I'm glad we're at a point now where we can look back and I can be like, "Yo, Friday the 13th remake is good," and a bunch of people agree with me instead of fucking taking pitchforks out and being like, how dare you?" That's still the most hate I've got to this day on any opinion I've ever made.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same way as in the 80s. If you were a horror fan, everyone would tell you, "Oh, those slashers are so disgusting and terrible." We've had to apologize for torture porn growing up in the era that we did. Everyone's always like, "Oh, I like horror movies, but I don't like all that torture porn stuff." But now, 20 years later, I'm kind of like, no, I think it's fucking great and valid in its own way. And reacting to things that were very specific to that decade. And you can only appreciate it in the rear view, though. So yeah, I think it's just as good as any other era, even though it was considered sort of a fallow period by hardcore horror fans who made us feel like we should be ashamed.
Yeah, that too. The gatekeeping was tremendous again because
Mhm.
we went the route of remakes so hard in the 2000s. It became so easy for everyone just to be like, "Oh, why would I see this? This is bad because it's not my 80s version. It's not my 90s. It's not my 70s
Yeah.
version. Like, obviously, it's going to be terrible." Yeah, I could talk about the 2000s horror movement for so fucking long, so I won't go on anymore. But yeah, I'm just nodding along with Rocco the whole time, being like, "Yep, yep, that, yep."
And also, just for the purposes of the movie that we're discussing today, it's an interesting transition period from film to digital, which is all sorts of technical geekery that maybe we don't want to dig into. But I think it's still sort of like the last real period of filmmaking, if you want to call it that, in a tactile sense.
Yeah, we talked about in the podcast before, down, and we spent like half the episode marveling that it just like looks incredible, and there's nothing special about it. It is a 2000s movie that about a killer elevator that just happened to also be shot on like real film stock in and around New York City. And it's amazing how, even accounting for some of the digital decay that we've seen, and the early technology pieces, the how much better it looks than sort of the smoothness of so much of like the CGI era stuff that we see. So I have, like Donato, I have my own opinions on early 2000s horror. Part of the reason why we're so close is because we disagree on pretty much everything. But I love, as much as I may not, that might not be a period that I particularly like going back and revisiting. I love hearing people talk about it articulately and passionately. So I will say both of you have made a really good case for checking out all those movies that I'll never ever watch again, that are probably still on Donato's child shelf in his childhood home. Who knows?
I was just tweeting about Stay Alive again. Like, Stay Alive fucking rules. Sorry, 2000s was good.
Okay, I just got the 4K of Land of the Dead. Go back to that fucking movie. I'm sorry, brilliant.
It's right on my shelf, dude. Land of the Dead is right behind me. I promise you that. I showed that to so many friends. I'm just gonna get a Dark Castle Entertainment tattoo and just let that do the talking from now on.
I mean, that would be a very good idea. I also feel like we should just have a podcast episode where Donato like pulls a movie off of his high school shelf and like defends it. That would also be pretty good.
I love that. I'd watch. I mean, listen or watch. It could
Or
be. It
both.
could. I
Yeah.
could have both elements.
There you go. There's your next Mary hour, Donato. You're welcome. Um, well, talk to me a little bit about how go blossoming at a little bit of a later age, Rocco, coming into the horror film at a time where most people, not the origin story that I think a lot of people give in the early 2000s, but to your benefit, it was also a time I think where we were starting to really, the internet was starting to give platforms to a lot of different writers and to a lot of different voices. So no matter how you felt about the films of the era, there were more people online writing about those movies in ways that was interesting and engaging. How did you come to start thinking that you wanted to find a place to write about movies for yourself?
Yeah, so just like my horror fandom, I came to writing pretty late. um, it's so funny. I always say that I started dating my partner. Now we've been together almost 9 years. We started dating when he was 19 and I was 26. And I always say he was a very mature 19 and I was a stunted 26. So we met in the middle. And he's the one who really pushed me to get into it just because he's always been so like driven, always has known what he's wanted to do. He's an art therapist. Um, and has all the self-confidence that I have always lacked. So when we started dating, um I was a theater kid growing up. I went to college for theater, which was not great. Shouldn't have done that, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. It was great. Oh, I love doing it.
Hmm.
And then I moved to Chicago, and I just sort of had like, I just wasn't doing anything. I wasn't really doing much theater. My passion for that had kind of, fizzled. And he said, "Well, what do you like? We should you should start working towards something that you like to do." And I don't know if you guys have been to the Music Box before in Chicago. I assume one of you have. Okay. It's the
No,
best.
unfortunately, yeah, we both know about it.
Yeah.
It's we have a lot of friends in the Chicago area that
Yeah.
talk about it incessantly, but I have never actually been to Chicago. It's on my first visit there. It's on my list of things to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best theater in the world. I used to go to Music Box of Horrors, and the very first time I went, that's their 24-hour annual 24-hour horror marathon. The programmer, I believe he still programs things there. I can't quite remember his name. Sorry, forgive me. But he was talking about, tracking down this rare print of Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, and how much effort it was to get from this guy's personal collection in Europe, and shipping it over and making sure it was well taken care of, and talking about how pristine the print was. And I was like, hey, this is really fucking cool. I've loved movies my entire life. Maybe I could get into something like this. So programming was the initial idea. Still working on that, but I just started sort of looking around for opportunities to write. I started writing for a now defunct website called Culturized. Did a couple pieces on there. My first big one was about sex in the cinema of Paul Verhoeven. This is when Elle was coming out with Isabelle Huppert.
Mm.
I also wrote, I'm pretty proud of this one, non horror, but it was a piece about how She Hulk is actually Marvel's Wonder Woman, like sort of their best female character, and they should really utilize that. We kind of saw how that went. Neither here nor there. Um, but I eventually got hooked up with Rue Morgue, and they were really cool and supportive of, just bringing new voices onto the website. And after a while writing for them, I started with listicles. I think the first thing I ever did was on Hagsploitation, because I'm a big old Hollywood guy, and it's a gay thing. We love camp, we love Betty Davis with witty, nasty barbs. Um, and after a while, they liked my writing, and I got to start pitching for the magazine. And from there, I've just sort of spread my wings. It's also funny because it's a Canadian publication. And I've done a few cover stories for them, but people are always confused. They think I'm Canadian, but I am not.
I feel like there are disproportionately, or have always been disproportionately, a number of really good Canadian horror mags. That just seems to be like something
Absolutely.
they've been really good at. So respect to our friends up north. As you were writing for Rue Morgue, as you continue to write for Rue Morgue, one of the things I'm always interested in is how people sort of find their niche, right? Like if you were to ask people, what does Donato write about? Remakes. Writes about a lot of stuff. Donato writes about all types of horror, but people know that he's the remake guy, right? Like I am the Catholic trauma guy. If people are like, what does Matt specialize in? It's like it's writing about Catholic trauma and horror. So, did you find yourself within the broad range of horror content that you could possibly be writing about? Did you find that there were a couple of particular types of movies, a couple of ideas that you kept coming back to again and again?
Yeah, I really love subgenres. So, like I said, the first was Hagsploitation. I also did a
Hmm.
list on Nunsploitation. I think that's really interesting. One of my first big pieces in the magazine was on female slasher villains of the 1980s. I love slashers, but I especially love regional slashers and underseen slashers. And female villains, you can't. I'm sure if I asked you two to think of one, it's kind of hard to come up with one, right? So that was kind of fun to dig into. Um, it's interesting because I was also thinking about this. I was listening to your episode on 555 with Sean Abley, and I have really tried early on. I tried to pitch myself as like the queer horror writer, and I like queer horror. I like, digging into that stuff, but it does, this isn't quite an answer to your question, but it's like that has not fit me as well as like picking a subgenre
Mm.
and sort of charging down that way. I think it's because queer horror is like such a big topic with so many diverse approaches, if that makes sense. Like, um, But yeah, I think it's more like I'm really into definitions and specificity and what makes a slasher, why one thing is a slasher and why one thing isn't a slasher. And I think that's kind of where my sweet spot is.
Yeah, like queer horror is an umbrella. Like there's
Yeah.
found footage under that umbrella. There's slashers. There's, like you said, down the list where I love honing in as well too. Like that is something I do. And I was going to interrupt you on your name a female slasher villain. I was going to be like, Dude, Bro Party Massacre, Motherface. What do you mean? It's so
Oh,
easy.
good job. Good job. No, you're perfect. I didn't mean to call you guys out. You did good.
That was just my one mention of Dude, Bro Party Massacre 3 per episode I had to hit. I have a quota.
Yeah, he does have a quota. We're sponsored by the residents of Dude Bro Party Massacre. That's what we got to do.
Gotcha. But yeah, I do like I like formulas and how things diverge within formulas. I think that's interesting.
Unpack that a little bit more, because I think that's kind of fun. You know, we often have discussions about the idea of canon building because so many of our movies are overlooked in the current era, but prime for reconsideration in future canons of whatever subgenres that they may fall in. So, how are you, especially when you're writing about stuff that's maybe a little bit newer, and it doesn't sound like you know, like a lot of writers, you may not hone in on a particular era. You're definitely a little bit more flexible, which I love about your stuff. Um, how do you go about approaching stuff and considering the contemporary, whether it's 2000s horror when there's all these social and political things that are influencing the way we think about them and having to push back against some of those preconceived notions, about contemporary modern horror where we don't know what we think about zombie movies quite yet or about trauma quite yet. You know, those are still works in progress for us as a culture. How do you start to build a canon and start to build up defining characteristics?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think this will probably be red meat for Matt. But I think in contemporary criticism, there's a problem with like not knowing what the roots of things are, not knowing where, what Smile 2, for example, is drawing from. That's in a tradition of horror movies. It just didn't emerge fully formed as its own thing. And I think being able to detect those echoes from horror past is really a skill, and it's a constant lifelong learning process. You guys talked about you pulled up my review of Scary Movie from 1991 that I wrote for Rue Morgue in 2019. I would probably say compare it to different things now than I did then, because being a critic and a film lover is a lifelong process of learning and getting more movies under your belt and getting more things to compare things to. Um, and I do think we are quick to dismiss things that may be canon later, right? It's going back to that whole millennial horror discussion we had. If you asked people living in the decade, it was like, these films have nothing in common. They're just violence for violence sake. There's not even necessarily an aesthetic you can pin down. Who cares? But 20 years later, you always know a 2000s horror movie when you see one. It's completely its own thing. So yeah, it's kind of tough. You don't really know what's going to stick and what's going to stand the test of time. I think that's kind of impossible, but you make your best judgment in the moment while you can, and you just look for patterns. And I think that's really fun about criticism too. It's like, we're in the 2020s, and I think we're having a hard time. We're all itching to define what 2020s horror is, but I'm not quite sure it's emerged yet. But it's fun that we'll get there eventually.
I mean,
Something. Yeah, go ahead. I was going to talk about that. Go ahead.
I was even going to say the simple part of it. It's impossible. I shouldn't say it's impossible. I'm sure there's people out there who have seen every single horror movie in the world and blah, blah, blah. But I know for what we're doing is in criticism and the way that we can't even keep up with what's being released, like let alone what has come prior. It happened recently. We were talking about Abigail between me and Monagle for a single bite episode, and the next episode we did was Livid with Jen
Oh my
Wexler.
god.
So I hadn't seen Livid at that point. Like I'd seen every Bustillo Maori movie except Livid. We finally got to do it for the podcast. I'm like, hell yeah. So a week later, I'm sitting there going, God damn it, I just had a whole discussion about Abigail and I hadn't seen Livid yet. Great. Yeah. Awesome. So like it happens like that. Like you said, reading your piece in Rue Morgue, exactly. You compared it to like Halloween, but all these other things like drawing into haunted attraction horror. And for me, I'm sure you would go back and maybe make some other assumptions now, because it's been years. You've had years to get more movies under your belt, and that's just, it's the life cycle of a critic. Like, we're always learning. You said, like, my whole thing is I'm never going to be the master. I'm always going to be the student. That's what this is. Like, we are always learning. I never want to get to a point where I think I know everything, because that's impossible. It's just not. And if anyone acts like they do, that's probably a tell on them.
Unless you're like Bilge Ebiri, in which case I do think you probably know most things.
Like I said, there are a select few that are
There's
like
a few, yeah.
top fucking tier.
Yeah. Donato, you and I were talking about that the other day too, because I think, looking at the trends piece, Rocco, we were reflecting on this year's release in movies. And I feel like 2024 has been the first year in a while where all of the stuff that I'm falling in love with is completely different from each other. Right. So if we're looking at something like In a Violent Nature, or, looking at Long Legs, or looking at, half a dozen smaller or bigger movies that have come out kind of across the board. Um, all of those things, Strange Darling, we did a whole podcast episode on it. One of the things that is so remarkable about this year in horror to me feels like most of the stuff is not like the other stuff. Typically, we're used to saying, like, oh, 2022 was our, or what was it, 2021, 2022? Those were our Me Too years, right? Like, we were processing some stuff in there. 23 was our COVID year, where like all of these like trapped at home type stuff finally hit the market, and we were able to talk about like what it was like for isolation and things of that nature. And it's not a bad thing. It's usually pretty fun and pretty engaging to have films working through a shared sense of societal stress or trauma. But I've been delighted by this year in particular because, to your point, like, I'm looking for themes in what a year's release schedule looks like. And this year it's just been like weird ass movies, blockbuster movies. Like Smile 2 is very different from In a Violent Nature, and they're both on the same top 10 lists and people still fall in love with them. And so there is also an element to the idea of building canons and looking for patterns, that it's kind of fun to step back and watch when they all fall apart. And you're just like, oh yeah, like all of these are just good movies, and I don't need to figure any of this shit out until like 10 years from now.
Yeah, definitely. And we're in a strange time, because I would argue that horror is more mainstream and more accepted and more prestige-y than it ever has been.
Mm-hmm.
But by the same token, you have Art the Clown making people throw up, even though it's the number one film at the box office. So yeah, it's hard to pick it out. And I think you're absolutely correct. It's like the themes have just not emerged yet. And I think the 2010s, it was a little simpler. It definitely felt like elevated horror was a big thing, as much as we hate that term. Social thrillers were a big thing. And that sort of feels consistent throughout the decade. Here, I'm still, maybe it's just because our times are so tumultuous. Like, there's not one big event we're reacting to. I'm not sure what it is yet, because like you said, it's like spaghetti at the wall. Like, there's just so many things happening. But I'm excited to see where we end up.
It's because we turn on the collider and we're in that like corrupt parallel universe now, right? It's really
Yes.
fucked with our movies.
I mean, I'm just hopeful that the success of Terrifier 3 specifically, like that whole franchise, I will go on record with saying I am continually baffled how this is the one that broke through.
Yeah.
I hate the first Terrifier. I think second is markedly better because there's an actual story. But still, my feelings on the films aside, my feelings for the success of it can only usher in, like, I don't want to say a new era of horror, but that whole era that we were talking about, that early 2010s into the early 2020s, really that whole decade was dominated by quote unquote elevated and quote unquote like trauma horror. And I am so very done with that. Everyone was too, I don't want to say like too afraid as like a right wing, like they were too afraid to murder girls and stuff. No, like that's not what I'm saying. But we got away from slashers. We got away from everything over graphic. We got away from horror being, what we knew it to be in the 80s and 90s. And if art is the one that ushers us back into letting a slasher like Thanksgiving, which I think paved the way even more too, like Thanksgiving doing as well as it did on a mainstream appeal, and art now taking over the mainstream. Like, if we get a new resurgence of slasher villains and we get a new generation of icons, that is where I hope we're going. I don't know if it'll happen, but
yeah, it excites me too. Smile 2 is my favorite of the year. I can't imagine another one coming out, but I do kind of love that we're heading back into franchise horror territory. Um, I love I love underground independent horror as much as the next person, but I don't know. Smile 2 is like Paramount dollars for this supremely grim pop star J horror adjacent sort of like chain letter freak out, and that really just gets me excited more than anything in the 2010s did.
And that's opening right next to The Substance. Like, The Substance was not
Oh
long
yeah.
before it too. So the
Yeah.
fact that two movies that couldn't be anywhere near each other, and Monagle, to your credit, like my top 5 is The Substance, Exuma, Infested, It's What's Inside, and Stop Motion. And none of those movies look anywhere near alike. They're all a separate
Yep.
subgenre. They're all a separate type of variety. So my God, if that is the type of roulette we can play moving forward for the next few years, I will be so happy.
Yeah, and I'm with you, Rocco. I sort of feel like there's a part of me that's just trying to chase the feeling I got the first time I watched Stir of Echoes, like all those years ago, where
Yeah.
it was like, oh, this is like a mid-budget, like the number of millions spent on this movie is more than 10 but less than 100. That's kind of like the vibe that I grew up watching. So I feel you. Bring back the mid-budget studio horror films. I'm here for it.
Yeah, I mean, I get enough no budget screeners in my inbox, and I love every filmmaker that puts their stuff out there and tries their hardest. But I'm sorry,
Yeah.
there's nothing like a big studio like Paramount throwing some dollars at a horror movie and letting a filmmaker, do their thing and see what comes out.
It's the film critics could just respond to every publicist with, "I'm not watching all that. Congratulations," or "I'm sorry it happened." That is literally the vibe that we could bring to every single email we get. All right, well, that brings us to our movie. We have talked a lot about the current state of horror, so let's go back to the golden days of horror, the pinnacle of the horror genre, Austin, Texas, in 1991 for Scary Movie. When we come back, we're going to get our hawks on. We'll see you in a second. All right, welcome back. As hinted before the break, our episode this week is the 1991 horror film Scary Movie. Warren, played by future Hollywood all-star John Hawkes, has a bad feeling about the local haunted house. So bad, in fact, that he spends his nights tossing, turning, and dreaming of being chased by a skeletal killer. But while Warren is a coward, no one can say he's a bad wingman. That's why Warren still enters the haunted house on Halloween, even with the news that a local serial killer has escaped from jail. Resurrected from the dead, thanks to a premium home video release in 2023 by the American Film Genre Archive, Daniel Erickson's Scary Movie remains a delightful tribute to keeping Austin weird. So, Rocco, Donato said, "You fucking love this movie. I want to do an episode on this movie. Come join the podcast. Let's go." So that is the why of all of this. But talk to us a little bit about that first screening that you had of Scary Movie, because I feel like this is something that you don't hype up. This is something you just find. This just shows up on a streamer now, or something, you stumble across a home video release back in the day, and you're sort of like, "Oh, hey, like this is kind of interesting. I'll go check it out. It seems like a curio." And I think it catches people by surprise. So talk a little bit about the first time you watched Scary Movie.
Yeah, absolutely. I got a screener from American Genre Film Archive when I was still living in Chicago. This is really funny, actually, because I had planned to record this in Austin, but I'm actually back home in South Carolina unexpectedly. So uh, I first saw it outside of Austin and before I lived there, and now I'm talking about it outside of Austin.
Nice.
so it's kind of like it's bringing me the vibe even when I'm away from home. Monagle, you live in Austin too, yeah?
Yeah. Oh yeah. This is our
Cool.
backyard.
Yeah, but you're pretty new to Austin as well?
I've been here for about 6 years.
Okay, cool, cool. Yeah, I've been about 3. But my first time seeing it, I was in Chicago. Like I said, I got it from AgFub and I just loved it. So this was right up my alley. I told you guys like I love a regional slasher, and now I wouldn't necessarily say it's completely a slasher. There's definitely just slasher elements to it, but there's nothing I vibe with more than a sleepy no budget regional slasher. It's not to everyone's taste, obviously, but even something like Terror at 10 Killer, which Vinegar Syndrome put out on 4K, which is like absolutely nothing happens in that. But I love to sink into it like a warm bath. Death screams, things like that. So this was right up my alley in that way. Also, the John Hawkes thing is like a big selling point, of course. But
Hmm.
even back to my first watch, you just don't get Halloween vibes like this. It's so specific, like just so specifically spooky in the exact right way that is unique on not like to this movie, but also just to like a certain vibe of growing up in a small town in the 90s. That, you know, I miss this sort of thing, this sort of low budget filmmaking where it wasn't trying to look expensive necessarily. It wasn't trying to look like a Hollywood made product. This is an Austin movie through and through, and I think that's really cool.
Donato, you also make as one of, we talked about like the beats of us as film critics. Haunts have been your thing since pretty much day one, and you have written multiple times about going around and seeing some of the like, Halloween horror nights and stuff in Los Angeles and other markets. So I want to know what you thought about Scary Movie, but I also want to know what your expectations were going in as you were sort of going through a subgenre of movies that isn't always the highest quality. And so you kind of feel like you get into a groove of just watching stuff, and then you don't expect anything new. So, where were you emotionally when you sat down to watch this one?
I had just seen like three absolute terrible ones.
Mm,
I just looked them up. It was called Scare Zone, House of Purgatory, and I did not like Hurt. I watched those three in a row, and I was ready to give up. I was like, "What am I doing with my life?
yeah.
What is anything?" As any list I write, because again, completionist, masochist, same thing. And then I popped this on because it was, I had my list. I was just going down it, and the John Hawkes of it all that had me optimistic. But talking about the regionality, Rocco, what you're kind of saying there, and I love the small vibe, small town haunt versus the big overproduced Six Flagsy Fright Festy kind of thing,
Mhm.
because when you're in that small town, it just feels like a slice of comfort. It just feels like you're watching the first scenes of this movie as they're walking through them building the house, and there's just like rusty nails pointing out, and
Yeah.
the corridors that are like warped because the wood is just not great. And so you just get that specific kind of vibe that just feels like a community hoedown, and it's inviting, it's fun. So then when horror happens there, it feels more communal too. Like it doesn't feel like there's just random people getting hacked apart and they're just there, blah blah blah. This is this is the town coming together to have a fun night. And when it submerges, like I don't know. I was just kind of into the atmosphere, into the vibe, into the invitation of it all. And it worked. Like, like it pulled me out of the fucking muck that was all the movies I had seen prior that like dragged me down. And I watched Haunted Ween right after this. And I do hold Scary Movie higher than Haunted Ween, but they're both those kind of like this is 1991, right? The other one was
Hmm.
1990, I
Yeah.
think. So like they came out right around each other, and they're both about like regional. I forget where Haunted Ween is. I want to say like Kansas or something like that. Something around that area. That you just don't get that kind of freedom when you go to a Hellfest or when you go to the one of the bigger ones. It's why I love Hell House LLC. Again, it's so specific to a lore and mystery, and like reading both of your pieces on the Austenness of it all made it even better. And they built the thing like right close to Salt Lick. I know where Salt Lick is. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to give a shout out to Darethis, who's one of the people that follows us on Blue Sky. You had gone to the well and were asking for recommendations, and I think that they were one of the people that reached out and recommended this. And I of course piled on Donato because it's a lot of fun, and I wanted you to take a look at it too. So if you're listening, Darethis, thank you for making sure that you're always out there recommending stuff that we watch, because sometimes it's that nudge that Donato needs to pick one movie over the other and salvage an entire project that he's working on in the process. But I want to talk a little bit about haunt movies too, or haunted house movies. Rocco, we'll start with you because movies about filmmakers, books about writers. These are the navel gazingness of the industry in ways that I think we all kind of secretly appreciate. And there's something interesting to me about movies about Halloween, movies that are overtly horror movies that are overtly about the activities that we get up to and the things that take place on Halloween. So, you know, Scary Movie is maybe explicitly one of the most Halloween movies that you'll watch in your lifetime, because the entire thing takes place between the hours of like 9 p.m. and 12 a.m. on Halloween. And I want to have you talk a little bit about the Halloween vibe of it all, the haunted house, the people in costumes, the drunken festivities, because as you said, that feels like it's a snapshot of sort of like the Richard Linklater version of Austin from back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And the director, what I sorry, I have to remind myself of his name.
That's okay.
Uh
Daniel Erickson.
yeah, the director Daniel Erickson talked about, wanting it to feel like how Austin does Halloween. So he was very specifically trying to imbue that into it. Um and like, yeah, you're right. There's a ton of horror movies that are set on Halloween, ostensibly trying to capture that vibe. But the thing about this that I think is so amazing is it's about the idea of make believe. It really captures that magic. There's that wonderful moment. I don't even know. A lot of people don't even notice it, but John Hawkes is looking at the mural of the skeleton killer on painted on the side of the haunt, and the door opens, and then the door closes, and the skeleton's gone. Like he's stepped into reality all of a sudden. And it's a very subtle moment, but it's constantly playing. The movie itself is playing tricks on you,
Hmm.
sort of like the tricks you play on yourself on Halloween, scaring yourself, or friends might play on you. Um, and yeah, the Austin vibe is very all over this thing. It's crazy that this movie was sort of unreleased for so long. I think it's simply because he wanted to retain the rights. I think they were talking about selling it to Troma at one point, but he didn't feel that like that was quite the proper fit.
No, that would
So
be
it,
a bad fit. Yeah.
yeah. So it was kind of like underground for so long, but it is so of a piece with, the filmmaking that was going on at this time, like the Richard Linklaters, Robert Rodriguez, the Coens were shooting their first movie here. Um, so it has a very tactile Austin vibe. And talking about low budget filmmaking in this era, they also had resources in Austin. You see a lot of low budget filmmaking from this time shot on video things, and they have nothing. you
Yeah.
know, they're working with absolutely nothing. But Austin was really booming this time, and was booming since the 70s with Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Apparently there are bone props in this that were used in Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. So they had a lot of stuff. They had the resources of the community. They cooperated with you know local folks, like the ambulances and the police cars and stuff. Those were all given to them by the city of Austin, not to keep indefinitely, but to use for the film itself. Um and it's so funny. I was listening to the commentary the other night. Monocle, have you ever been to Esther's Follies?
No, I haven't. I know the name, but I haven't been there.
Yeah, so it's this very Austin thing. It's this goofy ass variety show downtown. And the witch who is wandering around in the background is the person who runs Esther's Follies still 30 years later. So this movie is filled with Austin talent. The Pumpkinhead is the director's mother. It's just, it's yeah, I'm rambling now, but it just definitely has that homegrown vibe with the resources that were available to him also. And I think that's why it really works and is sort of a cut above most regional horror films of this time.
Yeah, and I think it was you, Donato, who said it earlier. It doesn't live outside of its means. Also, from a horror movie perspective, too. A lot of times is independent filmmakers. You get into this vibe where you're like, oh, I want to have this ambitious idea, and we don't have the budget to pull it through, and you can feel the compromises that go into it. But there is such just a nice sense of, hey, we're building we can build a creepy ass haunted house in like over a weekend, and we can get this shit done, and then pack it all up and we're good to go. I don't know. There's just so much more, because the people that work at the house, the guy that owns it, that we see, that has like the kid that keeps sneaking in because he secretly fucking loves it, right? There's all these little touches of this. Feels like if I were to go out, I live down by Bat City Scaregrounds in South Austin. Like, I feel like if I went to Bat City Scaregrounds today, a week before Halloween, then I could actually see like half of the people in this movie just like wandering around, plying their trades and doing their shtick. And I love that about the vibe that the film brings.
Well, I enjoy. I was looking at Letterboxd to find someone to talk about this movie because I wanted to. But while I was doing that, I also found some reviews, obviously, just because perusing. And one of my favorites was like a 1-star review, and all it said is, "I hate movies where people just stand in line the whole time." And it's like, to be fair, the first, what, quarter, third of this movie is Hawks and his little quartet just standing in line and, like, bantering, and but I think it's so crucial to the movie because, number 1, things are happening, Rocco, that you mentioned, where a delusion is being created if you're paying close enough attention. And number 2, you get a sense of who this guy is, like, who John Hawkes is playing, and the skittish nature, how awkward he is, like, you have to go to a pretty great length to pull off the trick that is the reveal in this movie, because any normal person in that arc is not doing it. You have to oversell the hell out of how anxious, dorky, and like Hawks is playing beyond a stereotypical nerd. Of the time, like, it
Yeah.
is rigid. It's a very rigid caricature. And if you don't have that, you don't get to pull off the trickery at the end. I love how this movie never once explicitly tells you what to believe. And it keeps showing you things over and over, whether it's we think a killer is going to come out and the scare actor is going to die, but that's proven wrong. Or we think the snakes are going to be real in the pit and that's proven like
Mhm.
everything over and over again. The movie is telling you what you were afraid of and your paranoias are not real. So just get over them and you'll be fine. So I love that train of thought and how this movie ends, because like we'll get there. We'll spoil soon. I don't want to spoil it
Yeah.
if you haven't seen it yet, but like in the next 5 minutes, we will spoil the hell out of it because I want to talk about the ending.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're gonna talk about the ending, but I want to talk a little bit more about Hawks. Rocco, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, and just wrapping up that thought about haunts in general and people standing in lines. I don't know, Matt. You could probably answer Matt Donato. You could probably answer this because of the list, but I think the time that they spend, the anticipation that they create waiting outside the haunt is so real and feels. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't feel like most haunt movies actually bother with that part. Like they create this wonderful anxiety and really capture the feeling of waiting to go inside a haunt that you might be too scared for. And it also gives me my favorite moment, which is when the little skunk girl comes out with her dad and he goes, "She couldn't hack it."
Yep. Yep. Wrote that one down.
Actually, very funnily that you mentioned it, I just glanced at my list, and you're right. Actually, most of these movies don't deal with the line, which, as someone going into haunts frequently, like Halloween Horror Nights, one of the best things to do is like get a cut water that's like 12%, and you got 20 minutes to kill. So you just get you power that down, you got a good buzz on, but you're spending 20 minutes with your group and other people around you, bantering, talking, and like getting that character building up a little bit. So I think that is an essential portion to the haunt season vibe, I think,
Yeah.
to say, where all these movies usually they'll take us inside. While that's happening, they want to show us the scare actors inside talking or something like that. And I think that is why this one, Scary Movie, gets its charm.
So it's the roller coaster thing, right? Like you're going to spend 20 minutes in line to ride a roller coaster for 90 seconds tops. And so like what is the more crucial part of that experience? Is it the wait or is it the you doing the thing? That's definitely something the movie gets.
And it's also entirely set up because the second half of the movie is entirely John Hawkes by himself almost. So, I mean,
Yep.
all the character building is outside, all the world building is outside. So, I think it's essential. And, like, if you're not, you got to take pleasure in every interaction that's going on, in my opinion.
And Rocco, that was going to be the thing that I wanted you to talk about because I know you wrote about it in your Rube Morgue piece as well. But there are two very specific influences that the director Daniel Erickson had John Hawkes draw on for this role, and it's so fucking fun. And I'd love for you to be the person that shares kind of like what the performance of Warren is built on top of.
Do you remember what I said in my review? Because I know what he actually said. I might have created those myself.
No, because I have them from the interview. So like it is
Okay.
retroactively, I have retroactively validated whatever you were quoting there by talking to the director in my Austin Chronicle feature and having him say those two titles too. So you were in the clear.
So was it Terror at 20,000 Feet and Ichabod Crane from the
100%.
Disney
Yes.
cartoons specifically?
Yes, it was. Yeah, when I talked to Erickson in 2023 for the release of the home video, he said that reference those two movies, the George Miller directed Nightmare in 20, specifically the John Lithgow one, as well as the animated 1949 short. And he said about John Hawkes, some scenes he's literally copying that character, the fear and the paranoia. And I think that's we think about the inspiration that actors look for and these long storied histories of cinema and Nick Cage being like incredibly influenced by German expressionism. And then you think of John Hawkes just like Ichabod Crane from the cartoon. I fucking got it. And then does that for 90 minutes. And it's a wonderful performance.
It really is. I mean, I love that he was drawing on those things. Um, and it also gets to the fact that the director, he knew what he was referencing all throughout this. He was
Mhm.
trying to sort of play with a lot of different tones and features and vibes from all sorts of different horror movies, and grabbing from different places in a magpie like way that I really like. And that's why it also feels like such a unique thing in unto itself. But yeah, John Hawkes is fucking incredible. I love that he still credits this movie with putting enough money in his pocket to make it to LA. Like, he finished this movie and then left for LA and did not even attend the premiere. So
Yep.
we wouldn't
Well,
have John Hawkes without Scary Movie.
I love the legacy of that for that. All right, before we wrap, I want to talk about the ending because part of the reason that I think we all love Scary Movie is it is in fact not a scary movie, not in the way that we think of with slashers. It is not a meta movie in the sense that it's not subverting our expectations. It's creating a very real, very scared character who does things that feel like they fit into a horror movie until you step just a little bit outside of them and think, why the fuck did I ever think this could be happening to me to begin with? So, Rocco, talk a little bit about sort of, and I don't want to call it the bait and switch because it's such an authentic and organic way of getting to where it gets to. So, sort of we'll say the misunderstanding at the heart of the movie that audiences get to appreciate. And if you haven't seen it, of course, now would be a good time to pause, go watch Scary Movie, and come right back.
Well, I'll just say that John Hawkes is obviously a born overachiever as an Academy Award winning actor, because here he plays the slasher villain and the final boy all in one.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
But yeah, I think it's really cool. There's you think it's going to be one thing and then it turns out to be something completely different. And it's yeah, it's hard for me to even say. It's such a fascinating performance. It starts out as a Halloween slasher, but it morphs into almost a character study in a way that I find really unique, and very compelling. The last scene one of the first scenes they filmed was actually the scene where he's covered in the pumpkin goo and sort of going nuts. And apparently that gave John Hawkes a place to build to. And you can see how measure by measure he builds to that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, that's all I have.
I mean, it's I see. On a second watch, it highlights the fact that Erickson himself, like as director, as visionary, going through scene by scene, he is telling us that there is no killer in there. Like, he is telling us every part of the way it's all in your head, and that is he's also telling his main character that there's a lot of mental games going on there. And again, I call back these specific moments. Like, my favorite one is you get like the biker guys, the thugs, who are gonna watch one of the kill sequences happen in the house, so should be fake. The slaughterer in this scene has stepped out prior, and someone comes back masked. And in any other horror movie, that's the villain. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
the bad guy, and he's about to kill this scare actor in front of innocents. It's gonna be gory, it's gonna be great. And you get hit the scare actor screaming, "Ah, don't kill me, haha." Wait, is that really you, Jeff, or whatever, like, who he thinks it is? Axe comes down, I think it's like a butcher's knife a few times, blood sprays, and you're like, "Oh no, the death happened." And then you get the line of dialogue from the scare actor being like, "Don't get so close next time." And it's completely fine. Like
Yeah.
they are playing with our expectations, doing that over and over and over again. And it wants us to believe that nothing bad is happening. But John Hawkes, as Warren, is keeping us in it so much still. I don't know how he is achieving the level of like fucking Charlie Chaplin-esque like physical comedy. Like, fucking go back to Evil Dead too. Like, that's Bruce in there. Like, there's so much physical emotion coming from his performance, the way his eyes can bulge, the way, like, all that stuff. And we believe there is something bad because he is so paranoid. He makes us believe that something terrible is happening,
Hmm.
and it is not him, and it is a real killer to such an extreme degree. And then we find out that's not true at all. It's just in his head the whole time, and it all just makes so much sense. And like that is the paranoia of being afraid in general. And like as a very anxious kid, like I get that. I understand why the thing I believe is so out of the realm of possibility, but that doesn't stop me from being terrified of it. And like, maybe to an extreme degree. So it's a really nice way of like depicting how fear can control us and how that can like ruin our lives if we don't realize it, because that's what I was getting at before. Like the whole commentary of, oh yeah, when you realize how ridiculous the thing you're thinking of, you can walk away from it. And
Yeah.
you know, if he walked away from it, he wouldn't have murdered a sheriff and cut some other guy's hand off in the haunted house. But he didn't walk away from it. He stayed scared. He never confronted his fears. And for that, he's now going to jail. A weird way of saying like you're going to go to jail if you don't overcome your fears, but still, you get the meaning.
No, but you're hitting on, I think, what is sort of the I think you could make a pretty strong political allegory to this, especially to modern day politics, which is the societal version of your mind makes it real, right? Like you look, at kind of a wide swath of Americans right now that believe that the world is so dangerous and so scary that it justifies them taking extreme actions, which lead to creating the terror that they were so afraid of in the first place. I'll put it that way. That's a decently gentle way of putting it. And so you look at Warren in Scary Movie, and you're like, there's an element of being like, oh, this is a tragedy because this is a guy who never should have been in this position to begin with, but like was unwilling to step away, and now he was traumatized, and there are these people that got hurt as a result of that. Then you stop and think about it and be like, no, he was kind of a fucking asshole, and he killed a dude and cut off another dude's hand, and it's entirely his fucking fault. And the only person in this movie that I have any sympathy for is the guy in the red plaid shirt that like is basically mocking him for the entire movie. That's the real hero of Scary Movie. But I think that's the political allegory kind of piece for it that I find that has a little bit more teeth every time. Is it's like this character just made created a fantasy in his head and then made it real because of his own fears and insecurities, and because he was unwilling to let himself not be pushed around by sort of his group of friends. Like his friends are awful, but so is he. And it's this thing where like this movie, I really hesitate to call it a horror comedy, though I'm sure a lot of people would, because I don't think that there's nothing that's like funny about it, in the sense that it's just sort of a mean group of friends and a guy that lets shit go too far. And you watch it now and you're kind of like, this is sort of the a precursor to incels, where you're like, well, this guy had some mean stuff happen to him, but Jesus Christ, he sucks. So I don't know if I can really get behind him all the way either.
Yeah, it's really funny, slippery movie because the set dressing is all very funny. The Austenness of it is really weird and funny, but then it leaves you sort of with this gut punch, icky, sad, creepy ending. Um, and it makes you kind of want to go back and re-examine everything you saw, like, and how the
Mhm.
movie is constantly playing with your expectations from the moment when he gets the fake stabbing and onward. It just keeps it, you never quite know what you're watching. You never know what you're seeing. In other movies this would be a problem, but like the architecture of the haunt itself is inscrutable. You don't really know
Yeah.
where things are located, but in here I think it is a bit of a strength because you're as upside down as a viewer as he is as a person in the haunt.
And
Um
I gotta, sorry to interrupt, Rocco, but I gotta
yeah.
add too, like the movie does an incredible job of playing with your expectations of low budget horror. So you're never really sure if that's like a highly produced haunt or a low budget movie that you're watching. So like the diegeticness, it's just like that's sort of the brilliance of it too, is you're like, oh, that's a dead body. Oh, that's actually a really good dead body for a haunt. Oh, that's not a dead body for a 90s like direct to video horror movie. So you're right. You're upside down as an audience member from the moment those doors swing open.
Yeah, and the whole tone is very dreamy and smoky anyway. So like you understand him even while you're like, oh, he's overreacting. Like as a viewer from personally, I believe that there's a killer on the loose the entire time until it's revealed that it's not. Like
Mhm.
and I am fully on his side. It is also interesting that you said, he's kind of an asshole because he's proud of what he accomplished in the end. Like that's he just keeps saying, I think he says he just kept coming, he just kept
Yeah.
coming, but like he is pleased with what he has done. um and I don't know what that says.
Yeah.
But like I said, it's a strange, yeah, just a curious little movie that is, like I said, slippery. It's never what you think it is, and it never goes where you think it's going to go, and it leaves you uncertain. And it is the most thrilling holiday of the year, like like the female character says.
Yep.
Well, I think that those last lines of "he didn't stop coming" or whatever,
Hmm,
he
hmm.
always kept coming. He had, Warren has to be the hero in his mind at that moment, because everything up to that point has been a failure. Like, he's terrified of everything. He couldn't get the girl in one of the most awkward non-kisses in fucking cinematic history. God, it's
Mhm.
excruciating, that scene.
Love it.
But once again, so very good, because like Hawks is, he's putting Porky's to shame in terms of like 80s, 90s nerdy guy portrayals. But
Can't
if
save a kid in his logic too. Let's throw that,
right,
like, it's a
exactly.
child endangered according to him.
So the ending of this movie is like, I did it. I killed the big bad. And once again, it's all an excuse. Like, everything that Warren builds in his head, like it's an escape from reality, but it's an excuse for the things that he can't do, in a way, and an
Yeah.
excuse that he conjures because it's just better than fixing himself or like working on himself. It's just, hey, if I save everyone from the big bad, then that makes everything go away and I can move on. And well,
And it's interesting that you say that, Donato, because one of the opening shots, and this is mentioned on the commentary, the facade looks like the Psycho house. Um, and it's sort of a bit like Norman Bates is let loose in a fun house. He's reacting negatively. You said the things that he can't do, he's enacting. So it is a little bit like that. I think that's drawing on some of that. Like, he seems like a well-behaved young man on the outside, but there's a well of danger and psychosis lurking with it.
also, I think last thing I'm just saying, production value, great. For a low budget, we
Yeah.
talked on all these things, but going back really quickly to what you were saying about the haunted house and how it feels like to me, it feels like a labyrinth, because people
Mhm.
just separate from each other. Like, I've gone through plenty of haunts, and unless you're in a delusion type scenario or a sleep no more where you're supposed to be taken away, like, you're on a strict linear path. Like, you are going through a haunt, there's people all around. Like, Warren's just walking around massive rooms with no one in them, and I'm like, what is this haunt? Like, we've seen them building it, that it's fucking the tightest corridors possible, and all of a sudden he's in like a dungeon, and I'm like,
Yeah, is this Doctor Who? Is it bigger on the
right,
inside? What the fuck is
Yeah.
this?
exactly. But again, wonderful, because there is a destabilization and there's just nothing that we can grasp. Everything is up
Yep.
for question. There is no sanity, and that is what makes this movie like, how did we just get so deep into a film called Scary Movie about, you know, about what we already talked about? Yeah. No.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say about that is, he loved naming it Scary Movie because he wanted it to feel like a generic, he says, a generic product, right? Um, so it's subverting horror expectations that we have, but not in like a spoofy, annoying way. It's just it knows what it's selling, and it's something different than what is on the tin, and I kind of love that.
So the last question we usually ask our guests, Rocco, is how does this movie find its audience? And I think Scary Movie exists. Sometimes we're like, oh, this movie kind of already has an audience. I think this movie has more of the potential for an audience than a lot of what we talked about. Right? It has the history. It was named Scary Movie Day in 1991 when the film was released by the then mayor of Austin. It is playing at the Alamo Village. It has played and will play again at the Alamo Village this month, and they'll be giving out free complimentary copies of the book that was written. That's like a kind of like a movie program more than an actual book, but that has a lot of the details about the history in the film there. So locally, regionally, it's got a lot going for it. But I guess the question then becomes, how do we help Scary Movie break out of its Austin confines? How do we say it's okay, you are from Texas, but non-Texas wants you anyways? So Rocco, how do you think that Scary Movie finds its audience outside of folks here in Austin?
Maybe double feature it with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because people love that outside of Texas as well. But yeah, it is a very Austin movie, and it is funny they show it every year with a Q&A from the director at the place it premiered, which is the same place Texas Chainsaw premiered, which I think is the Village. But it's a pretty easy sell for anybody. Like, if you like haunts, if you even like Halloween, this is something that you should be watching. It's one of the most Halloweeny movies ever made. I mean, the man falls into a big pit of pumpkins. uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so it is interesting. It's an easier sell than lots of the movies you guys cover on here. I just think
Yep.
you have to be in the right headspace for it, and in Austin fashion, if that requires a little, imbibing of certain substances, I think that's a great way to enjoy it as well.
A Diet Coke. I got you, Rocco. I'm picking up what you're putting down. Donato, what do you think?
Yeah, I was already thinking of the double features status. I mean, it's what I always like to do because how better to get someone to watch a low budget movie than pair it with something they already know. So for me, it's something like, hey, here's Hellfest, the upscale big budget version, let's say, even though it's even not the big budget. You understand by today's standards. But you take a Hellfest and then you say, also, I'm going to pair it with a similar film that's also a haunted Halloween attraction movie, and we're going to do both of them. So for me, that's the pairing. But if you want to appeal to the real fucking gonzo horror fans out there and you want to go all indie, I would put this with Haunted Ween so hard. Like, Scary Movie and Haunted Ween are two of the same ilk. Haunted Ween has a flamethrower in it. Come on. Like what? Like, he said there is a part where someone gets saved from hanging by a flamethrower. How else do you want me to sell Haunted Ween? I don't know. In any case, stick them together, put them on like a Shutter double bill, something of that nature. Have the pizza, have the
I think you
beer,
mean Screambox double bill. Excuse you.
Sorry, my bad.
Tubi.
Screambox, you're right.
Tubi.
I believe Tubi too. But yeah, I mean, it's got John Hawkes, so like there's some of the work is done already. Am I gonna go pitch on Monday? Here's the Halloween movie that you should watch, starring John Hawkes you never knew about, because that's gonna do great on SEO.
I want to know what the search volume is for John Hawkes' name. I got to open SEMrush. The only thing I'll add to what the two of you are saying is just like, and I like that you brought it up, Rocco. We talked about 555 recently on the show. That's a really, really fun episode about a really interesting and curio movie. But 555 is very much a regional film that is important because of the era it was released and because of, the slice of life that it captured. I would have a hard time ever recommending 555 to anybody. I don't think it's a movie that you should sit down and see. Scary Movie is not that. Don't hear us referring to it as a regional horror film and make assumptions about the quality, make assumptions about performances and things of that nature. It's incredibly coherent. It is incredibly thoughtful in the way that it's executed. Donato shouted out the production design. We've talked about John Hawkes ad nauseum. It is a real fucking movie in a way that will matter to folks who might not always seek out stuff that's on the margins of the film industry. So don't think you know what Scary Movie is just because it came out in 91, didn't have distribution for 30 years, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's a real movie. And I think you're really, really going to like it if you watch it.
And one more thing that I neglected to mention, that there's some language and some violence in here, but it really speaks to the child who loves Halloween. There's an innocence to the movie and a guilelessness despite the dark ending, that I feel like really captures that feeling of magic that we all used to feel as kids on Halloween. And I think that's really rare. So
yeah, the director has referred to it as, he tried to make a Twilight Zone short, and he did. And the flip side of that is that Twilight Zone is it's pretty accessible for all ages. It's not something that's going to like, I think you could show this to anybody of any age, and I think they'd have a pretty good time with it too. All right. That is our episode on Scary Movie. Rocco, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for bringing your Austin experience to bear with Sir John Hawkes. Do we knight our actors here? I don't think we do. With Sir John Hawkes and Scary Movie, the former Scary Movie Day movie of Austin, Texas. If folks want to hear more about what you're writing about, if they want to see your coverage in other places, in our current fractured media landscape, where are the best places to go, social media or otherwise, to stay connected to you?
yeah, thanks so much for having me. I don't usually podcast with boys, so this is a rare treat.
We're
um,
men, damn it.
um, but you can read my writing at Slant, Daily Dead, where you'll also find my Daily Dead buddy, Matt Donato. And then you can find my writing in print at Rue Morgue Magazine. I think our holiday issue is coming out very soon. I have an interview with Alice Mayo McKay a queer filmmaker from Australia. Pretty cool. And please listen to The Lady Killers, a Feminine Rage podcast on the Bloody Disgusting Podcast Network. I am the token boy, and I am joined by three lovely ladies every single week talking about female killers in horror movies. Yeah, pretty cool stuff. And oh, yeah, follow me on social media at Rocco T. Thompson on Twitter and Blue Sky. I've been starting to, it seems like people are slowly kind of reinvigorating Blue Sky. So check me out there. And then I am Rosemary's _Gaby on Letterboxd and Instagram.
Yeah, I see so many more angry people on Blue Sky than I did a month ago, which means we've reached the point and everybody's headed over. So,
yep.
Donato, how do people follow you this spooky season?
You can follow me, as always, at Donatobomb, DONATOBOMB. Twitter, Letterboxd. I'm going to put Blue Sky in the top tier now. We're Twitter, Letterboxd, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Donatobomb across the board. Follow me on TikTok. I might start that soon. I don't know. Having an existential crisis and need to start something new, so why not? And yeah, you're going to see lots of, well, not as much writing coming up. I've got a vacation planned and trying to get into awards season now that we're almost done with spooky season, but still a few more left. I mean, we got Nosferatu on the horizon, so of course you want to hear what I have to say about that.
Very, very true. As for myself, you can follow me on just Blue Sky. It's Monagle. What is it at? bskey.app.social or whatever. I can never remember that thing, but it's Blue Sky. It's a happy place still. It's fun. People don't seem to be too angry there yet, I suppose. But I would also. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No.
Yeah, I forgot one last thing since we're in spooky season and we were talking millennial horror. I have an interview coming out on Fangoria.com with Scout Taylor Compton talking about the 15th anniversary of my favorite Halloween movie, Halloween 2, Rob Zombie's. So yeah, check that out as well.
Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 is without question my least favorite film of all time. So Rocco, you and I are going to continue that conversation via social media. I think I am definitely going to be reading and sharing the interview that you've got coming out. But
I'm really excited to argue with you, and yeah, it'll be great.
Oh man, what I won't say it's a bad movie. What a maladjusted movie for me was Rob Zombie's Halloween 2.
But see, that's a positive for me. Maladjusted is exactly how I want my movies to be.
I ain't watching all that. Happy for you, or sorry it happened. As for the podcast and the website, you can follow us at certifiedforgotten.com. You can follow Certified Forgotten on your podcasting platform of choice. We are days, minutes, hours away from relaunching our site. It's almost official. I updated our Canva library with our new brand elements, so you know shit's getting serious over here. And we'll have more to say to you about how you can support the site then. But for now, thank you to Rocco. He's going to be the last guest we have before Halloween. So thank you for bringing the perfect movie to our table this year. I think we're going to head into the final week of spooky season with a bang because we got to talk about a great movie with a good guy. So thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, sorry. You got to take us out with something spooky.
Thanksgiving is for turkeys.